Uh, This session is focused on the state clean water revolving funds. And we have two presenters. One you can see right in front of you, it's me. And I don't think anybody has forgotten who I am, but I'm still Peter Stein. And the second is Shaun O'Rourke, who's on the screen. Fortunately, we have Shaun, who's an expert on SRFs, state revolving funds. And a little background on Shaun. Shaun is now part of a growing team at Quantified Ventures, principally taking folks who were either the managers or on the senior staff of state revolving funds and making them available to NGOs and other states to explore and even implement sort of the green side, the green investing, lending work that state revolving funds can do. You've had to put up with me for 2.5 days already, and it's going to be till lunchtime on Friday. So eventually you're probably sick of me now, but the reason I'm here is about 12 years ago, as a few of you know, Lyme Timber has had a consulting business that works with private grant-making foundations. And we suggested a grant to be made by the Doris Duke Foundation to the Trust for Public Land to hire, I think he was still in law school, Brian Schillinglaw, who then went to work at New Forests in California. And Brian did a paper about the use of SRFs for these kinds of purposes. So that was my introduction. I got to read the paper and it was kind of cool. And we didn't put it away. We always sort of kept it near the top of the pile of things we hope to experiment with at Lyme Timber. And David Hoffer shared this in his presentation on Monday, but Lyme Timber is still the one and only private profit-making entity to ever borrow directly from an SRF. And we did that not just because we're like tricky and creative. We did it because of the credible water quality outcomes that resulted from that loan. And that was a $50 million loan from Penvest. It came in 2 phases, but $25 million each. And that helped us buy what is now 160,000 acre ownership in north central Pennsylvania. But the reason that we got the loan was these are communities where the public water supply watershed for their drinking water, including town wells, is the private forest land we were investing in. And a condition of the loan was not to sell a conservation easement, but to grant a conservation easement on a portion of that land, basically to make up the difference between market priced lending and the concessionary price that we got for that loan. The other reason we're doing this is in Vermont, where I live. I have a good friend who now works with Shaun at Quantified Ventures. Her name is Teresa Thomas. And Teresa ran the SRF in Vermont. And we had a series of meetings about 5 or 6 years ago, exploring, some things she knew about from her time in Iowa, which has a very progressive, creative SRF program, to things that are going on in Ohio, to things that have been going on for quite a few years in California, and said, couldn't Vermont do something like that? And she was able to convince her colleagues, as well as get a short bill through the legislature to fix some barriers, that created an interim financing facility out of the SRF. So a number of times in the last 2.5 days, we've talked about there's federal money, but it shows up 2.5 years later. You don't have a patient landowner who wants to wait 2.5 years. You have to buy the property now. If you can reduce the holding expense for that 2.5 year period or whatever it might be, that's probably helpful for the financial viability of the conservation transaction. And actually the loan probably makes it financially viable because many land trusts don't have giant internal revolving funds that they can use for that purpose. So in Vermont, there are now about 6 examples, but they've been done by 3 groups: the Vermont Land Trust, the Trust for Public Land, and the Upper Valley Land Trust, which just happens to be my local land trust, each borrowed money from the state SRF at very reduced interest rates to finance the purchase of land that was essentially either sold to a state or federal agency. In the case of Trust for Public Land, it was an inholding in the Green Mountain National Forest, extraordinarily high priority conservation target. The owner lost patience a number of years ago. Trust for Public Land had to acquire the property, and the SRS financing was critical to Trust for Public Land's ability to acquire that property. In the case of Vermont Land Trust, they are one of the highest performing farmland conservation land trusts. I mean, they do forests too, but they really do farmland protection work well, but they do a lot of buy, restrict, resell projects. And they had a modest internal revolving fund, but it needed to grow. And they were able to grow it by getting essentially a bulk loan from the SRF, provided these were farms that had a water quality benefit for the Champlain Basin. So it's farms in the sort of eastern 2/3 of the state. In this case, my part of the state is left out, but I'll get over that. And they are using inexpensive financing to buy farms where farmers are, aging out of their ownership or don't want to farm anymore, selling a conservation easement. Typically a mixture of state money and NRCS money is paying for that conservation easement, farmland easement, agricultural easement, and then reselling the farm to an expanding farmer, a new beginning farmer with that easement in place, therefore a reduced purchase price for that startup or expanded farm owner so that the economics of farming are better. And then lastly, where I live, very cute town, Norwich, Vermont. The town borders has about 7 miles of Connecticut River frontage, and notwithstanding the fact that, for reasons I don't completely understand, the state of New Hampshire owns the entirety of the Connecticut River, not to a line down the middle. The SRF in Vermont lent money to the Upper Valley Land Trust to make a 300-acre addition to a town forest that is part of the upland drainage to a stream that flows into the Connecticut River. So in some ways, New Hampshire benefited from that, but we won't talk about that too much. So I just wanted to share that. I'm a big fan of SRFs. I became a significantly bigger fan when the bipartisan infrastructure law doubled, in some cases more than doubled, each of the SRFs with a gigantic infusion of money from the Environmental Protection Agency, and did 2 other things. Gave a little more priority to green infrastructure, conservation type transactions for the SRF, which were not remarkably clear in the original legislation that created the SRFs, and also expanded a term I'll use is loan forgiveness, but you may hear that as grants, meaning that if you can really demonstrate credible water quality outcomes, it's up to the SRF administrators state by state, but they can forgive part of the loan. It can happen in the old SRF money, but it can happen in the new SRF money. So I want to stop there. We certainly can come back to those examples when we do some Q&A after Shaun presents, but now I would like to turn it over to Shaun, who is part of the team that's working on this at Quantified Ventures. Prior to that, he ran the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and like a few of us in the room, even has a history of working at the Trust for Public Land. And Shaun is in my home state of Vermont presenting.
Thank you, Peter. And I just want to double check that everyone in the room can hear me okay. And I'll take silence. Yes. Great, thank you, Walker. Thank you, Peter, and I apologies for being remote and not in the room with all of you amazing people and friends and colleagues, and the list of folks in that room is really terrific, and really missing the chance to be there. But I do appreciate CFN and all the good folks for allowing me to join remotely, and I recognize that it's always kind of awkward to have the bobbling head on the screen, but hopefully can really use this time to present the work of the SRFs and demonstrate a number of opportunities that exist right now for how SRFs can really play a key role in the funding and financing quilt to get all of your priority projects done on the natural infrastructure side. I want to talk about how this program is tried, true, has worked in many different cases. We want to remove the hypothetical. And then now time is now, Peter just mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure law, $55 billion for water infrastructure, 44 billion of that was going to the SRF programs. The time is now to make a traditional 35-year plus program more traditional in terms of natural infrastructure being at the core. And we're working now nationally with many organizations such as TPL and watershed and conservation organizations to play that key convener and matchmaker and kind of the wind at the back of watershed groups to help utilities and municipalities recognize that we can solve water quality related challenges from a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to just be pipes and pumps. And so if we can start speaking the language, different nouns and verbs to be able to make sure that these projects are eligible for below market rate loans, such as through the SRF, increased principal forgiveness, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, allows your projects to get done better, faster, cheaper, and we can really start leveraging finance dollars to get projects done that have traditionally relied on funding, sort of dollar in, dollar out. And we think that that is the way that we can really start to drive these projects forward. And now is the time to be doing that with this increased infusion of dollars, increased pipeline of projects. And we think that if we have a chance to prove this out, the SRFs are going to be around well after all of this historic amounts of money from the federal government goes away. The SRFs will still be there. And if we think now is the time to be able to make those, make this work most effectively for all of the projects that you all care about in the room. So the SRF, what is it? And I'm going to just take kind of the next 15 minutes or so to give kind of a nerd overview of what the SRF is. I won't be going deep into any particular area, but kind of setting the stage. We can talk about specifics during the question and answer portion. Where does the money come from for the SRF programs? It's federally capitalized by the EPA. It's a federal allocation or formula funding. Every state gets a certain amount of money that has to be matched by 20% from the states. What's interesting there is like, where does that 20% come from? Oftentimes it's allocated through budget appropriations, but often it can also be paid for through green bonds, such as like what Rhode Island would do every 2 years to capitalize the program. That would go to projects such as you see on the right, natural infrastructure, wastewater projects, and so on. And then loan repayments would come back to be able to be recycled and put back towards more programs and projects in the future. So what kind of projects can be funded? Regular wastewater type projects. The key factor here is that if you look back over the last 35 years, $165 or so billion of investment on the clean water side with a B, 94% of that investment has been towards traditional gray infrastructure, pipes, pumps, wastewater treatment facilities. But the clean water program can fund other non-point source pollution projects, stormwater, energy conservation, and all the other slew of projects that you see here on this list. But there's a whole range of reasons why the majority of the projects have been more traditional gray. But again, now is the time to start thinking about water quality improvements. How can we work with utility districts and municipalities to solve their problems on the water quality side, but have multiple benefits resulting? And the projects on this list here are squarely in the middle of that opportunity. There's two programs as part of the state revolving funds. You have the drinking water program, and then you have the clean water state revolving fund. All of the conversation that we're going to have here is going to be focused around the clean water. Source water protection is often talked about as part of the drinking water, but actually it's not able to use SRF loans for source water protection. All of the source water protection and green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, all the green stuff really is going to be well aligned with the clean water fund. So in this conversation, when we say state revolving fund, we're largely talking about the clean water program. So why should we care about the SRF? Why should we care about the SRF now? We truly believe, and this is becoming more shared, and we're getting a lot of more collective nods in every room that we talk to, that the SRFs are the potential to be the largest impact investor for water infrastructure and natural infrastructure on the planet. It's proven history. There's being capitalized now. The loan money returns and can be deployed out. It's becoming more flexible. And as programs are getting more money, they're finding more ways that they need to get that dollar out the door. It's 100% financing, but the rates are incredibly flexible. It's project to project. Every program in terms of state is going to be structuring a little bit different. Loan terms up to 30 years. And why this is important is that it's the ability to be able to capitalize and loan these projects dollars over a really long period of time, what actually decreases the annual cost of these investments, as opposed to other private entities or going out on the public market in order to be able to get higher interest rates for a shorter period of time. It makes some of these conservation projects really difficult to pencil. And now with the infusion of dollars, as Peter mentioned, and I mentioned already, there's increased amount of money, but there's also increased amount of money. 49% of the additional bipartisan infrastructure law money has to be used for principal forgiveness. And you'll hear principal forgiveness, and Peter alluded to it. It is frankly a fancy name for the EPA's way of getting out free money. So it is a grant. It's just basically you're signing the loan agreement and saying your principal is forgiven. It's way easier to manage from an administrative point of view. So that's the majority of the states, pretty much all the states, are using principal forgiveness instead of a grant-based approach. But you can think about it as free money. SRF doubling in the next 5 years. We all know that. Now's the time to move. These projects are complicated. They take a long period of time. We want to make sure we capitalize on those appropriation dollars now. But the SRFs are having difficulty working on a lot of these projects and identifying projects. And I think that's my call to the folks in the room here is that in order for us to demonstrate that the SRF programs are well suited and appropriate for these types of projects, we need to build a really robust and strong pipeline of projects. We need to remove the hypothetical of, yeah, green infrastructure and natural infrastructure projects are eligible for funding. We need to be able to start pushing projects through the pipeline to see where those barriers are, so we can advocate to the states to better make their programs work most effectively for the non-traditional, aka green infrastructure projects, which have not always been well funded because they don't rank well. So why don't SRFs bother with non-point source pollutants? A variety of different ways. There's bias towards a lack of demand. I just mentioned the lack of pipeline, because watershed conservation organizations are like, I have a project, but I've never done the loan stuff, or I don't even know who to talk to in the state. There's a need right now to have connection, and that's a lot of the work that QV is doing around the country of playing that matchmaker of projects to financing and funding. The fact that it's a loan is oftentimes a major barrier, but once you start recognizing that the project done today is going to be cheaper than the project done tomorrow, and you can start to model that from a financing point of view with partners, the conversation changes. But we also need to look for the non-traditional revenue streams as well. If we're looking at natural infrastructure projects, they're oftentimes going to require other revenue sources, carbon, credit trading, nutrient trading in different places, especially in the Midwest. So those sorts of challenges are starting to emerge. We want to start to remove the hypothetical if we actually start to make these projects work. So the additional subsidy, this is something that comes up in every conversation early and often, and for rightfully so. How do we get the free money? We call it additional subsidy or add sub. You'll hear that quite a bit as you start to get into the SRF world. It can be applied in 4 different ways. Affordability criteria, which I'll talk about in a minute, how that could be applied. Stormwater, Peter mentioned the increase in green infrastructure being elevated as part of the discussion in the new bipartisan infrastructure law. Energy or water efficiency projects, and that can often be applied very broadly. And so we're seeing really interesting use of energy savings and conservation renewable energy projects, especially at wastewater treatment facilities, more on the mitigation side, but tied with water quality benefits. And then sustainable project design, construction, or kind of innovative projects is another aspect of the free money. States can give out kind of traditionally 10 to 40% of their federal grant amount as far as principal forgiveness, and that's in addition to the 49% that was dedicated to the affordability criteria or disadvantaged communities that are defined by each state. So the affordability criteria, and this is super important here. It seems really wonky. Every state, if you start to look at their intended use plan, which is a plan that every state puts out every year, and I would encourage you, if states that you're looking and to work in, look at their intended use plans on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. It's where kind of all the magic happens of the projects that are listed for that year. Where are they going to give free money? How are they prioritizing the ranking of the projects? It's really kind of the one-stop shop of all the information for every state's program. But if you look at the affordability criteria, and sometimes you feel like you need to have like a PhD in economics to untangle a lot of it. But it really boils down to these 4 criteria on the bottom: median household income, unemployment, user rates, population change. You'll see that in all 4 that's mandated, but there's oftentimes additional criteria. And what has been interesting to see over the last few years has been this shift from waiting for entities to apply and then see if they're eligible, to flipping the script of reaching out proactively to communities to say, hey, you are eligible for free money. Don't leave this on the table. Apply and we will help you identify projects to help you get that free money. I was just talking to my former colleagues in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank manages the SRF programs. And we did exactly that a year and a half ago. And we've almost doubled the demand in terms of green infrastructure and projects that are in qualifying affordability or disadvantaged communities, because of just the flipping of proactive outreach. And if you look at all the states and start to map which areas of the states you're working in meet the affordability criteria, and you overlay that on key priority conservation areas, you might have an opportunity to think about accelerating this work. But it might not have been apparent from the beginning if you haven't looked at the IUPs or even talked with the SRF programs. So all of the IUP cycles very different. I won't go into this in all detail, but I just wanted to kind of give a snapshot where it's really critical to understand, especially the early steps of the how do I get a project in the queue. All states have different deadlines for submitting projects. Some states require almost a very detailed engineering plan, having costs and almost going out to bid. Other states are like, just give me something and I'll put it on a list and then we'll talk about it. And so understanding what level of detail is needed to be able to get your project on a priority list or an eligibility list. I was just talking with Colorado, the state of Colorado's SRF program yesterday. Their eligibility form for the one time of the year, it's open for about a month and a half, is due the end of this month. So we're running around trying to get as many project partners to submit the eligibility form. Then we can take a deep breath, work with the state on trying to see if that's the right project at the right time. And then there's a number of other steps, and all of these steps are largely the same, but they just manifest themselves a little bit differently in each state. So really critical to look at the IUP and reach out to your the SRF program coordinator in each place. But know when the deadlines are is really the number one takeaway here. So how do we advocate to your state or the states you're working in to actually increase the amount of natural infrastructure, green infrastructure, non-point source pollution projects? The time is now. That $44 billion is not being taken lightly, especially with these state programs that have traditionally lost staff over the last few years and are now getting more money, have more eyes on the program, and are saying, we need to get this money out the door. Can you help us? And one of the ways to do that is increasing demand of the projects that we all care about. So understanding when these projects happen and when you can advocate is really key. I just mentioned the timelines in terms of submitting projects. This is a snapshot from Ohio, but at one place that we have found that's really critical to providing feedback on changing ranking criteria to get more information, to get higher scoring for green infrastructure projects, or trying to advocate for different affordability criteria to be able to allow for a larger swath of the state to be eligible, is in the public comment period for the intended use plan every year. And this goes out, and we're mentioning November to December here for Ohio. Every state is going to be different, but that getting your comments in writing and having the common outreach and sentiment, say from different coalitions and organizations and alliances, having the states hear that, oftentimes they just had no idea. They've been doing the same thing for 35 years and they didn't know it was broken. So being able to put in this written comment and hearing it over and over and over again about why we should be prioritizing conservation and natural infrastructure projects is absolutely critical. So how do you make your projects really visible? Oftentimes states, not all states, but many states require a municipal utility partner to be the borrowing entity. So watershed conservation organizations are going to be partnering directly with those entities who would be taking the loan out on behalf of the project. Other states do require direct lending to privates and nonprofits, but I would say the majority do require a municipal utility partner. It's an opportunity for you to build that strong relationship. And we have found that identification of projects and then showing how that project can solve an upstream water quality issue, reduce the need for gray infrastructure, reduce the need for pipe length or traditional basins, has really been just a fruitful conversation and allowed for other grant potential as well, above and beyond some of the SRF loan. Talk to the SRF staff. They're the ones that oftentimes are on the receiving end of why aren't we doing more, go faster, but oftentimes aren't engaged on the project side. So reach out directly to the program partners at the SRFs at the state. And they can walk you through whether your project would be good, where is it eligible, and that engagement we've found has been wildly helpful. And then submit a form, just submit the project. Mentioned earlier about the deadlines for eligibility forms, project intake forms, every state calls it something different. Just submit the projects. One of the pieces of work or a premise at Quantified Ventures right now is if we can just start flooding the SRF programs with green infrastructure, natural infrastructure projects, we can start to increase the visibility, start to demonstrate demand, and start to figure out where are the surgical tweaks in the process, in this seemingly very clunky and cumbersome process, that we can start to tweak that will allow us to get more projects through and ranked better. But we need those projects in the queue in order to help make the case, or it just becomes hypothetical. So advocacy for additional subsidy, this is really key. You all love free money. We all love the free money piece. The forgiveness for natural infrastructure components. Peter mentioned there is a little bit more in there in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but we need more money for the natural infrastructure parts of this. Forgiveness for resiliency. This is something that has now been coming up in many states in their ranking criteria, as well as in the forgiveness, is linking it as every project is reviewed. What is the long-term plan or life of this asset? Is a new pump station for a wastewater treatment facility going to be located in a floodplain that's not going to be around in 20 years, but they're taking out a 30-year loan? Looking at bested data and science to align with the investment and future asset allocation is going to be really key. And that opportunity to do that is around forgiveness. And there's been a number of examples of those types of projects and I can talk to a couple of examples in Rhode Island that we were particularly proud of. And then forgiveness in relation to affordability. This is a key area. Those states have to get that money out the door to communities. Again, flipping the script of, instead of just sitting back and having these states sit back and wait for projects to come to them, having the states do more proactive research, and having all of you in the room do the proactive connection of working with particular areas in a state that would be eligible to help those projects get along. That could increase the opportunity for increased forgiveness for projects as well. And then in terms of advocacy for financing terms, this one is—
Hey, Shaun, you have
Yes.
5 minutes.
Awesome, thank you. So there's incredible flexibility, as I mentioned. These programs, full stop, want to be able to make these loans. They're incredibly flexible. I would say the underwriting is tailored to getting the projects done. And so advocate for different loan terms that match up with the types of projects, different repayment structures, such as pushing payment terms out and with a later balloon payment. Oftentimes this is done with a lot of conservation projects. If we think that it's just going to kind of be a bridge funding opportunity until later philanthropic or other grant dollars hit to be able to pay back the loan, but you're able to secure the property earlier. Explicit discounts for natural infrastructure. This is being discussed in states and is going to, I anticipate, start showing up on more intended use plans in the next year. Is rate reductions. Georgia, for example, has a rate reduction for conservation related projects. It explicitly stated inside of their intended use plan. And then extended repayment terms. That 30-year repayment term is absolutely critical when we're thinking about larger investments and actually making conservation funding and financing actually be taken seriously as an infrastructure related investment. And then the priority rankings, EPA requires states to, and I think this is one of the absolutely critical components of this, in addition to knowing when the dates are, every state has to publish a list, project priority list of all of the projects that they received. They rank them based on a scoring criteria that is state specific. And most states, if you look through, do not place a strong weight for a variety of reasons on natural infrastructure projects. It just doesn't fit the traditional scoring criteria. So if you look at which projects have been funded and financed through these state programs off the last 30 years, you'll find a handful of natural infrastructure projects. That's for a few reasons. One, there just haven't really been many. And two, if you look where they fall on the project priority list, it's always at the bottom. And so it relies on other demand not being as high one particular year, and they actually have a few extra dollars for the conservation related projects. And then the affordability for these projects is sometimes factored into the ranking, but is not always factored into the overall demand or cost of the projects. And oftentimes it's only the demand on the sewer rates or the impact of that in terms of financial hardship to communities, and not the overall debt taken on for any future projects. And this is where the multiple benefit conversation can really come in. So understanding the ranking criteria that the states use to prioritize projects, in many states are well oversubscribed. You know, they might have 60, 70, 80 million dollars for projects, and they're having like a $2 billion on their project priority list. That ranking really matters. And so understanding what the ranking criteria is, and then almost writing to the test. So how do you write the project to meet the ranking criteria is absolutely critical, instead of just submitting something that may not meet the criteria. And your SRF program coordinators can really help that. And then engaging with SRF staff early and often. I've talked about that a few times. Understand where your comments can be most effective. That public comment period for the intended use plans really critical. Making sure that there's common messaging to make it seem like, yeah, that's pretty important. We've heard that a few times now, and that's where I think alliances and conservation groups really come in. And then there's outreach and mailing lists from each of these states. So if you're working particularly in some states, get on the mailing list, understand who's working on the projects, to really understand what projects they're looking to get done. And just some additional resources, and this is the last slide here before I get the hook from Walker. Resources for state resource, the SRF advocacy groups work nationally. We can connect you with those. There's a bunch of really exciting new research tools that are coming up, especially by EPIC and EDF, and Quantified Ventures has been a co-author on many of these. And on our team are a bunch of we self-proclaimed SRF nerds, and love to talk about this stuff as much as we possibly can, and just want to see these types of projects that we all care about become a core component of SRF infrastructure financing. So give us a call. Let's talk through projects. We just want to build pipeline, and look forward to being a partner on this work moving forward. So I will stop there and look forward to questions and digging in a little bit more. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
So I'm just going to take a wild guess that one or two of you might have some clarifying questions for Shaun, because he usually spends 3 hours covering what he just did in 18 minutes. So why don't we open it up?
Hello, this is Jennifer Elke Farley, Department of Navy. I'm sorry, this is going to sound like a very specific question, but I got really excited at the beginning of your presentation. We were talking about nature-based solutions and watershed management type work. We have or pursuing and have a lot of that ongoing out in the Pacific. So I was doing a quick search of the internet and I could not find a program in Guam. And I saw one for Puerto Rico. And
Yes.
so I'm just curious if you know why Guam doesn't have a clean water SRF program, and any advice on who and how to work with folks to encourage that to be a tool available on Guam.
Great question. I do not have the specific answer of why not Guam, but we have done some work with the Puerto Rico State Revolving Fund. But we are doing more and more work, especially with the DoD lands and the Sentinel landscapes nationally, and trying to include state revolving fund for national infrastructure on many of those projects. The EPA has been really involved. I can, if you could want to shoot me a note after this, I can find the right person at EPA for us maybe to go ask these questions together. But I think it's a really good point and a particularly well-suited tool for a lot of these like military installation type projects.
You'll ask about American Samoa at the same time.
Absolutely.
I don't have a question, but I have an offer of, I'm happy to share a case study where bringing together everything Shaun just talked about with what Kari Cohen presented before lunch about RCPP in Maine, where we had an RCPP grant and had a water utility finance their portion, their contribution to the RCPP by using SRF. So it was bringing the two together. So if that is at all interesting to anyone, I'm happy to chat more about that later.
Great.
One comment there. Sorry, Peter. All of these case studies, I think there's more out there than we talk about. And I think it's just really important that we're bringing up these case studies as often as we possibly can, because like I said, I've said hypothetical about 15 times. I used to talk about like pipeline. I feel like my new keywords are like, remove the hypothetical. We got to show that this stuff is actually possible. And states get scared when they're like, I don't want to be the first one. They're not. There's tried and true ways of actually getting this stuff done. So any case studies that are willing to be shared, all the better. So thank you.
Shaun, a question about loan payments after being paid back to the states. Do you see a possibility for those funds to be used as a source of non-federal match for other federal funding programs?
Absolutely. Great point. That's something I should have mentioned, that I apologize for going as quick as I could through this. The repayment of or recycled loan dollars removes a lot of the federal requirements. And as with every federal dollar, you all know, kind of comes with a lot of attachments. But after it's recycled back to the state programs, it does have the opportunity to be able to be used for a more wide variety of things, including some non-federal match. And so that's why it's really important for many of these states and the program managers to understand kind of which capital and which capital is being deployed to certain types of projects. So the answer to your question is absolutely yes. And that's something that we've been encouraging states to really think about. Some of these new larger grant programs, that have larger match programs, and municipalities have been traditionally a little more reluctant to use the loan programs. But if you can go to a town council or a city council and say, you can take out a loan, for $1 million, and you're going to unlock $10 million. That's a really good argument to make. And so that non-federal match component and utilizing the SRF and that quick access to capital really presents a unique opportunity. So long-winded answer to just being able to say yes.
Shaun, this is Eric Candela with American Forests. I'm working with Seth on the urban forestry stuff in Detroit. And I have a specific question and a general one. The specific one is, your slides seem to suggest that if the stars lined up just so, you could get 89% of your loan forgiven. Did I understand that correctly?
Every state is going to be different in terms of what cap they put on the amount of principal forgiveness for a project. I think I was just, and Paul, don't quote me on this one, but I think I was just looking at Arizona yesterday, and they were like 70% of a project if all of the stars aligned was the maximum. In Rhode Island, we did 100% principal forgiveness if the conditions were correct. So every state is going to be a little bit different, but I would try and work with the SRF programs to stretch every potential free dollar as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then the general question is, can you see us making use of the state revolving loan fund in Michigan to fund the work that we're trying to do in Detroit?
Absolutely. I think some of the urban tree projects, and for everyone else, Eric, you're doing really pretty awesome work in the urban tree space. Especially in Michigan. We would love to see if we can unlock some of the SRF. A lot of it comes down to who's going to be the borrower and having the municipality/utility be that critical partner to take on that loan. And I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of the modeling. I know you're working on some of this with Seth from our team of trying to make the case of how over the long term, 30, 60, and 60 years, how we can actually start to get more trees in the ground so they can start accruing benefit today. And then how do we stretch those dollars?
We have a remote question.
Shaun, is there anywhere we can go that would have a good guide to how we can access the CWSRF for natural infrastructure?
Absolutely. So there's a number of, so EDF just came out with a really good guide. EPA actually has a guide to non-traditional, and I love how they call the green infrastructure work non-traditional. That's the work we all have to do, is to take the non out of that and make it traditional. They have a guide actually how to access non-traditional green infrastructure projects through the Clean Water Program. I can put some additional, there's a couple of resources on the share drive. I can put some additional ones on there as well, so that everyone has access to it.
Hi, my name is Coral Edgington. I'm with the Army Environmental Command. Just because you were asking about some shared examples. So I have a lot of programs actually through the DoD REPI program that utilize these funds, particularly outside of Fort Liberty, which until last week was Fort Bragg. We have a smaller partner there, Three Rivers Land Trust, which really has a difficult time kind of leveraging federal. They're not as competitive on the federal grant realm. And they have a difficult time actually doing sponsorship by themselves, but they utilize a combination of those DoD REPI funds with these revolving clean water funds to do a number of transactions around the installation every year, to the point where they're actually now broadening their scope and able to hire on additional manpower for capacity purposes. And this is one of their primary sources of funding. So it's actually a fantastic program.
Is that in a Sentinel, in one of the Sentinel landscapes?
It is. It's Eastern North Carolina.
Eastern North Carolina. Okay. And I mentioned the Sentinel landscapes earlier. We're thrilled to be partnering directly with Quantified Ventures, partnering with 3 Sentinel landscapes with the DoD REPI program to help the coordinators of the Sentinel landscapes help do better collaboration and identification of these types of projects with the many partners that they have. And are working with Fort Huachuca down in Arizona, the Hill Country Alliance, which is Camp Bullis in Texas, and then the JBLM military installation in Washington. And we're just kicking that off now and excited to see where this work goes. But we see there's a ton of opportunity on the Sentinel landscapes and the conservation opportunities of kind of shared priorities and opportunities of inside and outside the base.
Shaun, it's Brad Gentry from Yale. Question for you. You've mentioned a number of times that the SRFs were traditionally used for pipes and pumps, and there's hurdles to get over trying to get natural infrastructure involved. Have you guys learned anything about the kinds of arguments that work well with the gray infrastructure people to get them more interested in green infrastructure?
I have one called early retirement. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, change happens one retirement at a time. We both understand that, Peter.
Great question, Brad. So a couple of things come to mind immediately. One is just more visibility on these projects. It's really striking if you start going through, and if you ever can't sleep at night, I encourage everyone to look through project priority lists and IUPs. But it's just incredible to see the lack of perceived demand. So I think one of the key challenges was there just haven't been many projects presented to the SRF program. 2 is kind of the combination of what are the repayment streams, and oftentimes it seems really hard. So working really closely with multiple partners to figure out how this loan would be repaid from the very beginning is going to be absolutely critical. So kind of going in with that, with the application and understanding those potential, I think would actually help accelerate the project.
I think if any of you start Googling the Penvest, which is the name of the SRF administrator in Pennsylvania, the borrowing by Lyme timber, you'll actually get an awful lot of information. And up until about a month ago, it was almost all negative. And we have someone who lives in this geography, and she can either support or counter what I'm about to say. But there were a set of I'll politely call extreme right-wing crazies. That's the polite version, who found it unconscionable that an out-of-state private equity firm called the Lyme Timber Company could borrow money at 1% for 20 years to the tune of $50 million to make an investment in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So they got to their legislators. So the governor is a Democratic, but the legislature is not. And they got to the legislature and required the state auditor to do an audit of the transaction. It took a very, very long time. It took 2.5 years for the audit to be completed, but we got an A+ on the audit. So if you begin to look into this, you're going to see a lot of interesting but crazy stuff. And then if you look in early May, the audit came out, and you can read the audit. About a year and a half ago, Timber didn't, but Penvest won the Pisces Award, which is EPA's national award for water quality innovation for this project. But I'm a little biased.
Hi, Shaun, it's Walker. I'm going back to the pipes and pumps line that Brad brought up. Here in Connecticut, actually with Quantified Ventures help, we dove into the black box that is SRF funding here. And we know that most of it is used for pipes and pumps, but we were also told, and if a conservation organization can partner with a municipality in a combined sewer community, then maybe we can talk, right? That was sort of that's the little crack in the door. And I'm wondering if you have any examples you could share of something that would fit that bill. And I'm interested in acquisition and protection of urban properties, as I'm seeking examples, perhaps more so than interstitial work of planting street trees or, rain garden construction.
So one example, and Walker, stop me if you're like, I'm just going off the rails in terms of your question. One project that was done in Rhode Island recently that I think is particularly interesting and kind of reframes the opportunity to work with the SRF and multiple partners. So the city of Central Falls, it's 1 square mile. I think it's the smallest, most densely populated municipality in the country. Incredible water quality issues, disadvantaged community by the definition of the state. There's one regional water utility called the Narragansett Bay Commission. They were under consent decree because of their CEO and discharging pollutants to receiving water bodies. They're doing a huge plan. And one of the plans, and as in many cities, was to build multiple tunnels to actually hold rainwater after it falls to reduce the impact of the CSOs. And so a bunch of community groups, including a few environmental nonprofits, said there might be a better way to do this, but we're actually unsure how to access some of the SRF. Narragansett Bay Commission's taking out $100+ million loans to be able to do some of this work. How do we actually turn this to actually be a community benefit instead of just hiding the water quality benefits that in infrastructure below ground? So they started looking around, and Narragansett Bay Commission, in partnership with the city, said, hey, is there places that we might be able to infiltrate this water? And one of the opportunities was an old underutilized, because there was rocks and glass shards of the high school athletic field. And if you look at the eligibility of the SRF, Narragansett Bay Commission was like, we can't use any of our money for this because we can't build a playing field to hope it infiltrates water. But what they can do was they can infiltrate water and actually have it be a stormwater subsurface detention facility that actually reduces the need for some of the larger tunnels. And hey, look, we just have a cap on it that happens to be a turf playing field. And what was interesting was working with the environmental organizations was the advocacy to start thinking creatively about a turf field being a subsurface detention facility. Just happened to have a green top on it. And then the utility was able to utilize the SRF dollars, the funds from the SRF loans they were doing, to actually fund the rehabilitation of a really critical public park, amenity, open space, green space for a Central Falls High School that hasn't been able to have a home game in over 5 years because the field was in such terrible condition. And so thinking creatively about how letting no regulation go to waste, and thinking about the variety of different players, and thinking about how every project might be able to get to yes, even if it's something like a park, there hasn't, and I know the TPL work well, thinking about the opportunities to what is eligible, and then how you actually translate that to the program with a variety of partners is key. So I could see a connection there, and I think maybe where you were going with some of your TPL work in the urban areas.
Yeah, if any of you, I don't think anybody here is from Atlanta, might be people who are joining us remotely from Atlanta, but if you ever get to visit the Fourth Ward Park, 94% of the construction cost was financed by the local water authority using SRF loans, and 6% was financed by the Parks Department. But it has some people, obviously, for the 94% payer, the water feature in the park is called the retention basin. And for the 6% payer, the water feature in the park is called a swimming pool.
We have one last question from a virtual attendee. For the bond issuance you mentioned, was it a federal bond issuance or state issuance? Who were the investors, if you can remember the specific case?
If I am remembering correct about when I said the bond issuance, it might have been for the match to unlock the federal dollars. And that was done through a statewide bond issuance through a general obligation bond, voter approved in the state of Rhode Island. And that's typical if states are going to be using statewide voter approved bonds for this type of work.
Well, unless there are any more remote questions, I would love to be in the position to give you 4 minutes. Or 7, whatever number.
He fixed the clock.
So I want to thank Shaun. There is an awful lot here that he shared that's in the Google Doc for both background and now foreground reading. This is an emerging field. I will appeal, just as Shaun did, the more case studies, the more examples, so that we just don't have to have brave SRF administrators, that if it happened in Ohio, well,